What would make a hotel seal off one of its rooms for 3 decades? Not renovate it, not repurpose it, just lock it and throw away the key. I'm not talking about a room that needed repairs or had water damage or was being used for storage. I'm talking about a room that was generating revenue, that guests were paying to stay in, that was part of the regular rotation. Until one night in the early 1980s, when management made a decision that still haunts the Queen Mary to this day. They took Stateroom B340, a perfectly functional first-class cabin on the luxury ocean liner turned hotel, changed the locks, pulled it from every booking system, and pretended it didn't exist for 30 years. No tours, no maintenance crews unless absolutely necessary, no guests, just silence, and whatever was left inside after the last family checked out bleeding and traumatized, refusing to tell anyone what they'd seen in the corner of that room. You don't seal off a profit-generating asset unless something happened so disturbing, so legally dangerous, so inexplicable that keeping people out becomes more valuable than the money you're losing. The Queen Mary never released an official statement about why B340 went dark, never explained what changed between it being a bookable room and it becoming the ship's best-kept secret. But the staff knew. The families who stayed there knew. And eventually, when the internet started comparing notes, everyone started to piece together a pattern that made one thing crystal clear. Whatever was happening in B340 wasn't random, wasn't coincidence, and it absolutely wasn't stopping just because they locked the door. But to understand what lurks in B340, you need to know what this ship really is. Because the Queen Mary isn't just a decommissioned ocean liner floating in Long Beach Harbor. It's a vessel that's seen more death, more tragedy, more violent endings than most cemeteries. And when you trap that much trauma inside steel walls for nearly 90 years, it doesn't just fade away. It concentrates, it intensifies, it waits. And trust me, the room wasn't the first thing to die on this ship. The ship's dark history. The room they sealed for 30 years. The Queen Mary was born in 1936 as the crown jewel of luxury ocean liners, a floating palace that carried celebrities like Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, and Winston Churchill across the Atlantic in Art Deco splendor, breaking speed records and redefining what it meant to travel in style. But that golden age lasted exactly 3 years before World War II turned elegance into something much darker. When Britain needed to move troops across hostile waters, they stripped the Queen Mary of its luxury fittings, painted the entire ship dull gray for camouflage, and started cramming 15,000 soldiers into spaces designed for 2,000 passengers, transforming the floating palace into a high-speed troop transport they nicknamed the Grey Ghost, because it could outrun German U-boats and vanish into fog like something that didn't want to be seen. But speed has consequences, and on October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary was slicing through the North Atlantic at nearly 30 knots when it accidentally collided with its own escort ship, the HMS Curacoa, cutting the smaller vessel completely in half like a knife through paper and killing over 300 sailors in minutes. And here's the part that still makes crew members uncomfortable. Wartime protocol meant the Queen Mary couldn't stop, couldn't turn around, couldn't rescue anyone. It just kept going while 300 men drowned in its wake, their screams swallowed by the engine noise and the gray water. Those sailors were just the beginning, because between 1936 and 1967, when the ship made its final voyage, at least 49 people died aboard the Queen Mary in ways that ranged from tragic to inexplicable. A 17-year-old crew member named John Petter was crushed to death by a watertight door in the engine room during a routine drill. Door 13, they called it. And workers down there still report seeing a young man in coveralls walking through that same door like he's perpetually late for a shift he'll never finish. The first-class swimming pool, empty now and drained for decades, was where multiple people drowned, including a little girl named Jackie, who slipped under the water in the 1940s while her mother's back was turned for just a moment. And guests who wander past that pool today report hearing splashing when there's no water, seeing wet footprints leading from the edge to nowhere, catching glimpses of a child in a vintage bathing suit who vanishes the moment you try to focus on her. There were deaths in the boiler rooms from heat exhaustion and equipment malfunctions, deaths from passengers who mysteriously disappeared during crossings and were never seen again, deaths from fights and accidents and illnesses that turned a luxury liner into a catalog of human tragedy. And every single one of those deaths left something behind, an echo, an impression, a piece of consciousness that couldn't or wouldn't move on. By 1967, when the Queen Mary docked in Long Beach for the last time on Halloween night, and yes, that timing should tell you something, it wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a floating graveyard containing almost 9 decades of concentrated death, fear, and unfinished business. A steel vessel packed with the emotional residue of world wars and personal tragedies and violent endings that had nowhere to go, because the dead don't disembark, they just wait. And graveyards have a way of refusing to stay quiet, especially when you start inviting people to sleep inside them. When the Queen Mary opened as a hotel in 1971, Stateroom B340 was just another first-class cabin with ocean views and Art Deco fixtures. Nothing special, nothing different from the dozens of other rooms along that corridor, except that within months of opening, the housekeeping staff started finding things that didn't make sense. Small things at first, like guests checking out early without explanation, or beds that looked like someone had thrashed violently in their sleep, despite the guest claiming they slept fine, or towels arranged in patterns on the bathroom floor that no one could explain. The first official complaint came in 1973 from a businessman who woke up covered in bruises, dark purple marks on his arms and chest, like someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave fingerprints. Except he'd locked the door from the inside, and he was completely alone. The hotel offered him a refund and moved him to another room, wrote it off as a nightmare or sleepwalking, didn't think much of it, until 3 months later, when a woman in B340 woke up screaming at 2 in the morning with the sensation of hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing, and when security rushed in, they found her gasping on the floor, red marks circling her neck like she'd been strangled, but the door was still locked from the inside, and she was the only person in that room. That's when the reports started accelerating, guests waking up to their covers being ripped off the bed so violently they'd be thrown to the floor, furniture that had been against one wall now pushed to the opposite side of the room while they slept, the temperature dropping so suddenly that people could see their breath even though it was summer in California, and always that feeling of being watched from the corner near the porthole, that specific corner where shadows seemed darker than they should be, and where every guest reported feeling like something was standing there, even when they couldn't see anything. A couple on their honeymoon in 1978 checked out at 4 in the morning after the husband saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed, a man in what looked like old naval uniform just staring at them, and when the husband jumped up to confront him, the figure didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring until the husband turned on the lights and it vanished like smoke. But the cold remained, that bone-deep cold that made their teeth chatter. Management started quietly avoiding booking B340 when they could, leaving it empty when possible. But this was a business, and empty rooms meant lost money, so they kept putting people in there, and the incidents kept escalating. A solo traveler found scratch marks on the inside of his luggage like something had tried to claw its way out. A family heard footsteps pacing the room all night despite everyone being in their beds. A woman opened the bathroom door to find all 3 mirrors shattered from the inside out, glass on the floor, but no impact point, no explanation, just broken reflections scattered across the tile. Then came the final straw, the incident that made the Queen Mary's management realize they couldn't keep ignoring what was happening, couldn't keep explaining it away or offering refunds or pretending this was normal. Early 1980s, exact date scrubbed from official records, a family of 4, mother, father, and 2 young daughters, booked B340 for a weekend stay, and on their second night, the father was found unconscious on the bathroom floor with a gash on his forehead, while his youngest daughter stood in the corner of the main room, screaming that the man in the corner wouldn't stop staring at her, that he'd been watching her all night, that he wanted them to leave, that he was angry they were in his room. Security searched every inch of B340, found no one, no evidence of forced entry, no way anyone could have gotten in or out. But when they tried to calm the little girl down, she pointed at the corner near the porthole and said, "He's still there. Why can't you see him? He's right there." And that's when one of the security guards noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every single mirror in the room had shattered, not just cracked, but exploded from the inside. And in the bathroom mirrors, broken pieces scattered across the floor. If you looked at them from a certain angle, the fragments reflected a figure that wasn't in the room, a shadow of a man standing exactly where the little girl was pointing. The family was hospitalized for shock and minor injuries. They threatened to sue. They demanded answers the Queen Mary couldn't give. And within a week, management made a decision that told you everything you needed to know about what they really believed was happening in that room. They changed the locks on B340, pulled it from every booking system, removed it from tour routes, and for the next 30 years, that door stayed shut, gathering dust and silence, while whatever was inside waited in that corner, watching an empty room, trapped between the steel walls and the ocean, and whatever had happened to it make it refuse to leave. The Queen Mary's management made a decision that night. They locked B340, changed the locks, removed it from booking systems entirely, pretended it didn't exist for 30 years. But here's the thing about sealing something in. Eventually, someone always opens it back up. And when they finally did in 2018, when they decided that 30 years was long enough and the haunted room could be turned into a profitable paranormal experience, what they found inside wasn't gone, wasn't weaker, wasn't ready to be commercialized. It was stronger, angrier, and it had been waiting.
In 2017, the Queen Mary's new management decided that 30 years of keeping B340 locked was a waste of marketing potential, that ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts would pay premium prices to spend a night in the ship's most infamous room, that whatever had happened in the 70s and 80s was ancient history and could be repackaged as entertainment. So they sent in renovation crews to clean it up, update the fixtures, make it bookable again. And that's when they discovered that 3 decades of silence hadn't made whatever was in B340 go away. It had just given it time to get stronger. The construction workers reported tools disappearing from their belts and reappearing across the room, batteries in their drills and flashlights draining completely within minutes of entering B340, even though they'd been fully charged, the sounds of footsteps pacing behind them when they were alone. And one painter swore he saw a woman in a vintage 1940s dress standing in the bathroom mirror, full color, solid as anything, staring at him with hollow eyes. But when he spun around, the bathroom was empty. And when he looked back at the mirror, she was gone, but the glass was ice cold to the touch. One crew member quit after his ladder was pushed while he was standing on it, not bumped or knocked, but deliberately shoved, sending him crashing to the floor with a sprained ankle and the absolute certainty that something wanted him out of that room. They finished the renovation because they had to, because the money had been spent and the marketing campaign was already rolling. But every single worker who'd been inside B340 refused to stay after dark, refused to be in there alone, and several of them admitted privately that the room felt wrong in a way they couldn't articulate, like the air was heavier, like something was pressing down on them, like the space itself was hostile to human presence. B340 officially reopened in April 2018 as a paranormal experience package, premium pricing, waivers required, and the very first guests to book it overnight were a pair of YouTubers with camera equipment and skeptical attitudes. They set up multiple cameras, EVP recorders, temperature sensors, the full ghost hunter setup, and for the first 3 hours, they documented absolutely nothing, made jokes about wasting money, started to relax, but at exactly 3:33 a.m., every single piece of their electronic equipment malfunctions simultaneously, cameras showing static, recorders producing high-pitched squealing, and their phones, brand new, fully charged phones, died completely, and when they tried to reboot them, the screen showed corrupted images of the room's corner, that specific corner near the porthole, over and over in glitched cascading loops. A couple celebrating their anniversary thought it would be romantic and thrilling to stay in the haunted room, but at 2 in the morning, they heard scratching sounds coming from inside the walls, not above them or below them, but literally inside the steel walls. And when maintenance checked the next day, they found fingernail marks scraped into the interior paint in a section of wall that was inaccessible, that no one could have reached without tearing the room apart, marks that looked fresh and desperate, like something had been trying to claw its way through metal. A solo traveler, a woman in her 30s who'd stayed in allegedly haunted locations all over the world, set up an audio recorder and went to sleep, and when she reviewed the footage the next morning, she heard her own breathing, the sound of the ship creaking, normal ambient noise, and then at 3:33 a.m., a child's voice, crystal clear, saying, "He's still here," followed immediately by a male voice, deeper, angry, saying, "She knows," and then silence. And the woman swore she'd been alone, swore the door had been locked, swore she would have woken up if someone had entered. But there, on her recording, was proof that something had been in that room with her, speaking, aware, intelligent. Multiple guests reported seeing their own reflections in the bathroom mirror behave independently, blinking when they weren't blinking, moving slightly out of sync, and one man watched in horror as his reflection's mouth moved like it was speaking, even though he was standing perfectly still. And when he leaned closer to see what it was trying to say, his reflection reached up and touched the glass from the inside like it was trying to push through. But the pattern that emerged over dozens of bookings was the most disturbing part, the detail that made even the skeptical staff members start to believe something genuinely wrong was happening in B340. The room got colder the longer you stayed in it, not gradually like a broken heater, but progressively, deliberately, dropping 1 degree every hour, until by morning, guests were shivering under multiple blankets in summer, their breath visible in the air, frost forming on the porthole glass, even though it was 70 degrees outside, and the cold always concentrated in that corner, that specific spot where the little girl had pointed in the 80s, where the mirrors had shattered, where every photograph seemed to show shadows that weren't attached to anything. Guests consistently reported the same dreams when they managed to sleep, dreams of drowning in dark water, of being trapped underwater and looking up at a ship's hull passing overhead, of cold ocean filling their lungs, and they'd wake up gasping, soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperature, with the taste of salt water in their mouths. The activity spiked at exactly 3:33 a.m. every single night without exception, that precise time, and it took researchers months to make the connection. October 2nd, 1942, when the Queen Mary collided with the HMS Curacoa, the ship's clocks stopped at 3:33, frozen at the exact moment of impact, the moment 300 sailors died in the water. And somehow that timestamp had burned itself into the ship's memory, into B340's very existence, a temporal scar that opened every night like clockwork. The entities in B340 weren't just residual hauntings, weren't just replaying trauma on a loop. They were aware. They knew they were dead. They knew they were trapped.
and they were getting increasingly aggressive about making the living understand that this was their space, their room, their ship. And every night at 3:33 a.m., that boundary between death and life thinned just enough for them to reach through. But the strangest part, the detail that has staff members genuinely frightened and has paranormal investigators from major television shows begging for access, the thing that wasn't in any of the old reports from the 70s and 80s, the thing that's new and getting worse. Every single person who stays in B340 for a full night, without exception, wakes up to find photos on their phone that they didn't take. And the photos are always the same thing.
The photos on their phones are always of the corner, that specific corner near the porthole where the shadows pool darker than they should. Just a simple shot of an empty corner in a dimly lit room, nothing obviously terrifying, nothing that would make you scream, until you zoom in, until you expand the image and look closely at the grain, at the texture, at the pixels, and that's when you see it. A figure's shadow visible in the digital noise, a silhouette of a man standing in that corner. And here's what makes people delete the photos immediately and sometimes throw their phones away entirely. The shadow isn't standing against the wall, it's standing in front of the wall, like whatever cast it was between the camera and the corner, invisible to the naked eye but somehow captured by the lens, recorded by technology that sees things human eyes can't process. Multiple guests, different phones, different nights, all waking up to find the same photo taken at 3:33 a.m. according to the timestamp, all showing that same corner, all containing that same shadow when you zoom in far enough. And the really disturbing part is that in some of the photos, if you enhance them, if you really study the shadow's shape, you can see it's not standing still, it's reaching toward whoever's sleeping in the bed, arm extended, fingers spread, frozen in the act of moving closer. The cleaning staff won't enter B340 alone anymore, not since one housekeeper went in at noon to change the sheets and found the door locked from the inside, even though she just watched the previous guests check out and leave. And when maintenance finally got the door open, the room was empty, but the bed sheets were arranged in the shape of a body, perfectly tucked in, like someone invisible was lying there waiting for the next occupant. Security footage for the corridor outside B340 glitches every single week, always at night, always showing several frames of static before resuming. And during those few seconds of static, you can hear, if you turn the volume up all the way, the sound of a door unlocking from the inside, the heavy mechanical click of the bolts sliding open, even though no one's in the room, even though the door remains closed when the footage clears. Maintenance logs that aren't shown to guests document that the door to B340 unlocks itself approximately once a week, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always from the inside based on the mechanism's wear patterns, and they've changed the lock 4 times now, and it keeps happening, keeps opening itself like whatever's inside is testing the boundaries, seeing if it can get out, checking whether the barrier between B340 and the rest of the ship is still holding. But what the Queen Mary really doesn't want you to know, what isn't mentioned in any of the ghost tour scripts or paranormal investigation packages, what you have to dig through decades-old ship manifests and cross-reference with crew records to discover, is that Stateroom B340 was occupied during the Queen Mary's final voyage in October 1967, the last crossing before it was permanently docked in Long Beach. And the passenger manifest shows that room reserved under a name that's been heavily redacted, blacked out, erased from official records, with only one stamp visible in the margin: deceased at sea, do not process. Someone died in B340 during that final voyage, died in a way that made the ship's administration want to bury the paperwork, erase the name, pretend it never happened, and whatever killed them, accident, suicide, murder, something else entirely, left them trapped in that room, bound to that corner, unable to leave even when the ship stopped moving, even when the ocean was replaced by a harbor,
even when the Queen Mary transformed from a vessel into a hotel. They've been there for over 50 years now, that presence in the corner, getting stronger every year, feeding off the fear of guests who stay the night, growing more solid, more able to interact with the physical world, more capable of making themselves known. And the staff genuinely doesn't know what happens if it gets strong enough, if one night it doesn't just appear in photos or move furniture or scratch walls, but actually manifests completely, actually steps out of that corner and into the room with whoever's sleeping there. The Queen Mary's website still takes reservations for B340. You can book it right now, tonight if you want. They've got a paranormal package that includes the room, a ghost hunting kit, and a waiver that you have to sign acknowledging that guest experiences in Stateroom B340 may vary and management is not responsible for unexplained phenomena, which is the legal department's way of saying, we know something's in there, we know it's getting worse, but we're going to keep selling tickets until someone gets hurt badly enough that we can't cover it up. The reviews on travel sites are split almost perfectly down the middle. Half the people say nothing happened, they slept fine, it's just an old room with good marketing, total waste of money. But the other half, the ones who actually experience something, they don't leave detailed reviews. They just post things like, never again, you couldn't pay me to go back, something touched me, it knew my name. Short, desperate warnings from people who clearly want to say more, but can't quite bring themselves to relive it in writing. So if you ever find yourself in Long Beach, if you're driving past the harbor and you see that massive gray ship floating there like a monument to elegant decay, if you're feeling brave or curious or stupid enough to test whether any of this is real, B340 is waiting for you. The door's unlocked, well, until it locks itself from the inside, and you can spend the night in the room they sealed for 30 years, the room where something died and refused to leave, the room where every night at 3:33 a.m. the boundary between the living and the dead gets thin enough to touch. Just remember, when you close that door behind you and turn off the lights and settle into bed with your phone charging on the nightstand, you're not locking the world out. You're locking yourself in, and whatever's in that corner has been waiting decades for someone to stay long enough, to sleep deeply enough, to be vulnerable enough that it can finally do what it's been trying to do since 1967, reach out from the shadows, cross the distance between the corner and the bed, and finish what it started. And you won't be alone. You'll never be alone in B340, because the dead don't leave, and they don't forgive, and they absolutely don't appreciate tourists treating their eternal prison like a theme park attraction. So when you wake up at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of your phone camera clicking by itself, when you see your breath fog in the summer air, when you feel the temperature drop and the weight of being watched, and the certainty that something is standing in that corner staring at you with hollow eyes and decades of rage, just remember, you paid for this, you chose this, you walked into their room, and now you're going to understand exactly why they sealed it for 30 years, and maybe, just maybe, they should have kept it locked forever.